it's time to introduce our first speaker of the day. She's the Assistant Director of Strategy, Forces, and Resources Division at the Institute for Defense Analyses. She leads Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and the Chemical and Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Analysis Group. That group employs a variety of quantitative and qualitative tools to assess risks, identify needs and capabilities, evaluate established and emerging technologies, and examine future WMD health and security challenges. She received her PhD in biochemistry, cellular and molecular biology from the Department of Neuroscience at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore, Maryland, where she is trained in neuropharmacology and molecular neuroscience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katherine Sixt.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. I'd just like to thank DTRA first, thank Dr. Han, thank Carl, and thank Carla for all of their help in setting this up, and thank you for the invitation to come out. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, good. So what I want to talk to you about today is kind of an elaborate title there of WMD, past and present and future, but also the role of scientists and industry in that, and in protecting the nation, and also in a historical role in actually creating WMD, and what that dualistic nature is for scientists. And to start that out, as Carl said, I am trained as a scientist, but there was an experience I had when I was about 11. We all kind of went through it at the time, if you were alive then. It had to do with the use of chemical weapons on the Kurds. And so when I was 11, I was really struck by that occurrence and the tragedy that happened at that time. And after that, I was struck by it. I was struck by the international response, and we'll go back to that at another time. But after that, I went on and studied science and decided I wanted to do my PhD and went down that road. And then at one point, I made a shift and decided to go back to what I continued to study while I was doing my PhD. I continued to study WMD and learn about it, learn about sanctions, learn about what happened in Iraq, learn about chemical weapons and biological weapons again and again. That's not the role that I think that every scientist should play in protecting the nation and protecting the world against WMD, so that's not what I'm going to argue for everybody. That was the path that I took. But I think that there's a role for every one of you in this, and that's the piece I want to talk to you about today. So just the standard disclaimer, these are my views, not necessarily anybody else's. Okay, so starting with that, I'd like to start with Einstein. As we know, he had a role in WMD and also had a shift later. And this is from the Pugwash conferences back in 1955, the first manifesto. One of the other things, there's a quote up there from the manifesto on there, but one of the other things that the manifesto said, signed by several scientists, it's called Russell Einstein, but there's many scientists on there. It also said that it talked about the different disagreements throughout the communities about whether there should be communism, whether there shouldn't be communism. And he also said that this WMD and the fight against WMD is something that everybody should be able to agree on, and that they would try to make it so that what they said was something that would be something important for everybody, and there wouldn't be a disagreement on that. So I'm going to try and make sure that the words that I echo here are like that, in that this is something that affects us all, and we all would peril equally in it. So something I really like to think about are alternate futures. I like to imagine myself somewhere else. Right now, I'm not going to tell you where I'm imagining myself, but yes. So I like to imagine myself in other places. I like to imagine that the world didn't go as it did, and it went some other way. So I want to talk about what could have been, what is, and what might be, what will be. So I talked about growing up in the 80s, so anybody else who grew up then might have read Choose Your Own Adventure books. I love Choose Your Own Adventure books because I get to turn to page 42 and do one thing, or I get to turn to page 86 and do another thing. But I really like Matt's quote at the top there, this 11-year-old boy who talks about these choices that you make throughout the book and how they can take you down one road. And it seems like it's going to solve everything, but then you wonder if it's a trap. And I want you to think about those things as we move forward, that the choices we make, even some of those little choices, they might seem like they will solve things, but they might also not. And I think that that's what happens too for some of our scientists back in our offensive program in the earlier times, that they thought it would solve everything, but it didn't. So, and then I want you also to think about, what could have been. So Man in the High Castle, I love Philip K. Dick as well. So thinking about what would have happened if World War II didn't go the way it did. So we're going to think about what would have happened if the international community hadn't responded and pushed forward the BWC. So anybody recognize this? Yes, the 8-ball, right? So 8-ball, if you've ever been on NCI campus in Frederick, there's the 8-ball sitting there. It's on the National Historic Register of Places, and it was actually a joke to put it on there. They applied, after the program ended, they applied to have this put on the National Register. And lo and behold, it got accepted, so now you cannot tear it down, and you have to preserve it forever. But that's what it is. It's defunct now. We don't use it. But this was it in the 50s, and you can see the scientists working there. And after it had been put on the National Register, one of the scientists who had worked there said this at the bottom, that it was this symbol of creativity and inventiveness. So us pushing forward to find biological weapons that would kill other people was a symbol of our inventiveness. And this was something that he really believed. And I'm not knocking the scientists for really believing that. There was a cultural movement at the time that led science down this road. And we took all of our advances that we had been making in toxicology and microbiology, and it was just going for the good of humanity, and then you get this veer off where we start to make weapons with it, and weapons of mass destruction. And the scientists participated in that. So I want you to take that step back and think about this alternate future. What if we hadn't stopped it? What would you be doing right now? Would you have been the graduate student who walked into a lab and said, here's your project? What was that project? What would it have been? Could this have been you in a much more modern 8-ball? So you could have been doing that, but you're not. Why not? Well, you're scientists now who are defending. You're building defenses against chemical and biological weapons. That was part of the program too. So that wasn't new in the program in the 50s, but now this is all that we do, and we're dedicated to this. And this is stopping chemical and biological weapons and protecting the warfighter and protecting the nation as we go forward. So science itself is not responsible for warfare. And we think about emerging technologies. We get nervous. Should we regulate this piece? Should we regulate that piece? But science itself is not responsible for the warfare. But as Roseberry said, biological and chemical weapons too are science turned upside down. So that's this trajectory that we go on with science that takes us down this road, and then we veer off and we turn it upside down. So why didn't we do this? Well, it wasn't a giant switch right away. In 1969, we just didn't switch. We did, we stopped it, but there was a movement that took us there. And it really goes back much farther than that. And it goes back to our practices of warfare, what we do during war in international humanitarian law, which has 3 pieces to it in jus and bello. It's discrimination, proportionality, and necessity. And the big one here that has to do with chemical and biological weapons is discrimination. Proportionality and necessity are also arguable there, but discrimination is one of the biggest things that pushes this forward. You cannot discriminate. These are used indiscriminately. And these movements that started, you've got the Law of the Hague and the Law of Geneva, all of these underpin the BWC and the CWC. And this is a slow march that happened over time. Even while we're making these weapons, this slow march continues, where cultural shifts happen and we move eventually to the treaties. And it starts before that. We have a history. The first time we codified our customs of war was during the Civil War and in the Lieber Code. And this was a treatise that was put forward by Francis Lieber and Lincoln at the time. And at the bottom, you can read this piece. And they talked about poison. They talked about chemical weapons at that time, that it doesn't admit of cruelty and no poison in any way. So back then, we were even starting down this road. Sure, we made the offensive programs and we stopped them later, but we walked down that road and there was a movement towards it. I want you to think about those cultural shifts and how important they are to keeping that going. So it's not an alternate reality. This is what really happened. We went through the Geneva Protocol. It took us a long time to ratify it, but we did it. And we have the BWC and we have the CWC. So I want to take you back to Ypres in Belgium and the first use of chemical weapons. And when we talk about what takes us there, part of it is the horror of the use. This is the only thing I have written down, so, but bear with me because it's written in my handwriting. So, but it's not my writing, it's not my words. So it's Willy Siebert. So Willy Siebert was one of the Germans who was part of the attack on the French, this first attack and use of chemical weapons. And later he wrote a letter to his son describing it. And the horror of it, the reason I wanted it written down is I didn't want it filtered through my memory, which is quite imperfect. So I wanted to make sure that we got it right. So I hope you permit me to read this to you. But what he said was, finally, we decided to release the gas. The weatherman was right. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining. Where there was grass, it was blazing green. We should have been going on a picnic, not doing what we were going to do. We sent the German infantry back and opened the gas valves with the strings. About supper time, the gas started toward the French. Everything was stone quiet. We all wondered what was going to happen. As the great cloud of green-gray grass was forming in front of us, green-gray gas, sorry, that was a lot of GRs, we suddenly heard the French yelling. In less than a minute, they started with the most rifle and machine gun fire that I had ever heard. Every field artillery gun, every machine gun, every rifle the French had must have been firing. I have never heard such a noise. The hail of bullets going over our head was unbelievable, but it was not stopping the gas. The wind kept moving the gas toward the French lines. We heard the cows bawling, the horses screaming. The French kept shooting. They couldn't possibly see what they were shooting at. In about 15 minutes, the gunfire started to quit. After about a half hour, only occasional shots. Then everything was quiet again. In a while, it had cleared, and we walked past the empty gas bottles. What we saw was total death. Nothing was alive. All the animals had come out of their holes to die. Dead rabbits, moles, and rats, mice were everywhere. The smell of gas was still in the air. It hung on the few bushes that were left. When we got to the French lines, the trenches were empty, but in a half mile, the bodies of French soldiers were everywhere. It was unbelievable. Then we saw there were some English. You could see where men had clawed their faces and throats, trying to get breath. Some had shot themselves. The horses, still in the stables, cows, chickens, everything, all were dead. Everything, even the insects, were dead. That was his experience of having used the chemical weapons. That's the indiscriminate nature of them. And it's partly that use and then the cultural movements that come forth from that, and also the movements that lead to the abolishment of them later. So this is a picture of all of the countries that have signed on to the CWC. So there's a few that still haven't. So it's 193 out of 196 states parties to the CWC and 182 to the BWC. This is what that map looks like. This is international consensus. Now, granted, there are rogue nations that are doing things. There are questionable practices and there are questions about certain people who have signed on to this treaty. I'm not negating that. What I'm saying is that an international consensus generally moving together this is what pushes this forward and says, culturally, we disagree with this. Culturally, we will not do this. One of the things that allows us to set those norms and to push those norms forward is our science, and it's leading in our science. We started to regulate the fields of microbiology and even later recombinant DNA technology because we were leading in our fields. So the American Society for Microbiology also helped a lot in the offensive program. So they were a big contributor to it. And at some point, there was that shift among scientists that said they didn't want that anymore. And they stopped participating in the program. And then the BWC was signed. And later, scientists and innovation, Alexander Titus was talking about this yesterday at one of the sessions. He talked about the amazing innovation of the American people. And it was that innovation that helped us lead in recombinant DNA technology. And we were then able to regulate it, partly too because we had so much funding going at it. So if you're holding the purse strings, you can certainly regulate a lot. And those are regulations that are still in place today. So that alternate future didn't happen. You don't study biological weapons, and you're not in the 8-ball. So where will we be? So I have to go back to Philip K. Dick, and I want you to think about a little bit post-apocalyptic and dream of electric sheep with me, just a little bit. So in that post-apocalyptic future, how would we get there? How might that start? Where are we now? Well, it might start with small, tiny little cracks in our defenses and in our treaties. The cracks start every time WMD are used, whether it be ricin, whether it be an attack on your brother in an airport, whether it be attack and an assassination. All of those are uses of chemical weapons. It might be uses of chemical weapons for police actions. And these continue when these attacks are used on a larger scale, when you look at rogue nations using them against their own people, violent extremists using them on large scale. And it's not just their use, it's the international response that matters. So I take you back to those events that touched me and affected me when I was a kid. And think about the response we had to Halabja as an international community. Now, I'm not saying it's black and white and then we did everything right and today we're doing everything wrong. It's not black and white like that, and I don't see it that way. But we did enough then. We started the OPCW after that. We signed another treaty after that. And so an international consensus can possibly trigger people to change, and it can also affect the young people growing up, like this little girl when she saw it. And it stayed with me forever and brought me here. So cracks with every use, especially when it doesn't result in international response. So what does that mean? So is it possible to turn this more green? You're all here today for a reason, with a purpose. You're pushing this forward. You are part of this international community that moves forward our response. And can we turn more of this green? Can we make this go further? And what is the role that you will play in that? So future, thinking about WMD challenges in the future. You can't change the past. The past happened, we went down a road, and we turned, and we went down a different road, and we abolished the weapons. But what happens with dual use and emerging technologies? Remember, I talked about that road of technology as we go along, and we're plodding along, making advances, and then it can turn off and become a weapon of mass destruction. What is your role here? Well, one of the things is protecting chemical and biological defenses against cyber attacks. So thinking about your chemical and pathogen data, but also just cybersecurity in general, and security of your biological data and your chemical data. What sorts of efforts are you putting forward in that to be able to control that and protect from those attacks? These are vulnerable. Protecting your critical infrastructure. One of the things, when we look at agriculture here, the food and agriculture were targets of chemical and biological attacks. It was part of our old offensive program. And to think that it's not part of people who are making programs today, it could be. And so this piece of it, right, when we look at agriculture and protecting the agriculture sector, we can think about the ways that we looked at agriculture in the past and the way that we look at it today. Before it was on food scarcity. We need to re-envision the way we think about what an agricultural attack would look like on the US or on a developed nation. It's not about food scarcity anymore, it's about economics. How do we think about that and how do we envision what an attack would look like and be prepared for it? Information and data surety. So discerning the real from the fabricated. Thinking about your data sets. When I think about biological data sets and the reference sequences we used, are we sure of that data anymore? How are we protecting that data to make sure that our data sets are right? So when I pull that reference sequence, I know what I'm actually looking at, that the reference is true. And what we start to understand about data surety and looking at these, basically finding the signal from the noise, what's real out of it, I've often wondered if we can start to apply some of those tools when you think about that to also when we think about information surety. So when we have so much noise coming in on information and information warfare, what is the real message coming through? Can you start to take what you know in data analytics and apply it outside of that now in an information warfare situation as well? So what you do in biology and chemistry, can you apply that out? And thinking about expanding that window. Protecting your genetic and your health data. There are so many attacks on our healthcare system with our healthcare data going somewhere. So we're losing our health data. That's an important component of it. Is that data protected and what is being done with it? What could be done with it? And protecting your genetic data. If any of you have patient samples or any sort of microbiology samples, who is doing your sequencing? What do they do with that data? That data is important and it's powerful. Are you giving away your data? Are you sending samples off and just giving it away to find out your genealogy? What happens with that data? So thinking about how to protect that and what can be done with that going forward. And lastly, I want to talk about Thermo Fisher when we think about a role of industry in this. And Thermo really took a stand when they decided to protect values and norms in some of our technologies. And these are two quotes when they decided to stop selling their sequencers when they were being used to for ethnic minorities and suppressing ethnic minorities, and they stopped selling it there. That costs the company, but that's also a moral stand that you take that says we won't do this. As we plod down the road of our technologies moving forward, the things where they could be used and corrupted and gone off that way, how do we keep them from going off that way? Well, it's partly up to everyone who has those technologies, right? So it's partly in protecting it in that way. So there's kind of when I thought about this group here, there's kind of two groups here. There's a group that is protecting, providing defenses directly, right? So you are working directly in the labs in Edgewood and in Frederick, and you're making these defenses directly. So you're doing this direct protection of it. And then there's a whole, and this is, that direct protection is really important, the science and technology that's happening in those places. And so we know exactly how your efforts are affecting the protection of the nation against WMD. But we also can think about the role of everyone, not just people doing direct science on defenses, chemical and biological defenses. Some of you may have a contract here where you're doing a little bit of research, but you also have a role along the way. You're part of the solution to this. So the decisions that you make, the choices that you make in protecting your technology, protecting your IP, so you can continue to lead in these fields, protecting your data and making these choices. So thinking back to what choices we make and what Matt said about, as we go down, Matt, the Choose Your Own Adventure kid, said about going down these roads of the choice I made I thought would solve everything, but did it. So thinking about the consequences of those choices and you being part of that solution to come together with that. And so I'm going to leave with this slide and take questions, but I want to, so this is an actual drawing before the seal was actually produced of the US. So there's lots of lots of symbolism in the seal, but there's a part of it that I really, really like. I like a lot of it, but there's a part I really like, which is the bundle of arrows in the eagle's left talon. So the bundle of arrows is a symbol of the 13 colonies coming together. But it doesn't start with those 13 colonies. It actually goes back to the Iroquois nations. So the 5 warring Iroquois nations. And so it's a nod and grew from and the Iroquois Confederacy, where the 5 warring Iroquois nations came together and decided to have a treaty and protect each other. And then there was a 6th one that was added later, and they did a bundle of arrows. And that is our bundle of arrows today. So what I want to leave you going forth with is that the international response matters. That bundle of arrows as we move forward matters in what happens with WMD in the future, whether we have cracks and we devolve or we continue to evolve as humanity with that. And it also is important here as a community of people who come together from so many different places to make changes happen in chemical and biological defense. So I thank you all for your contributions that you make here. It's important. The work you do is important. So thank you, and thank you for your time.